reproach gladly bear. Then he'll call me someday to my home far away, where his glory forever I'll share. So I'll cherish the cross, the old rugged cross, till my trophies at last I lay down. I will cling to the cross, the old rugged cross, and exchange it someday for a crown. On a hill far away stood an old rugged cross, the emblem of suffering and shame. And I love that old cross, where the dearest and best for a world of lost sinners was slain. So I'll cherish the cross, the old rugged cross, till my trophies at last I lay down. I will cling to the cross, the old rugged cross, and exchange it someday for a crown. Oh, that old rugged cross, so despised by the world, as a wondrous attraction for me. For the dear Lamb of God left his glory above to bear it to dark Calvary. So I'll cherish the cross, the old rugged cross, till my trophies at last I lay down. I will cling to the cross, the old rugged cross, and exchange it someday for a crown. To that old rugged cross I will ever be true. Its shame and reproach gladly bear. Then he'll call me someday to my home far away, where his glory forever I'll share. So I'll cherish the cross, the old rugged cross, till my trophies at last I lay down. I will cling to the cross, the old rugged cross, and exchange it someday for a crown. On a hill far away stood an old rugged cross, the emblem of suffering and shame. And I love that old cross, where the dearest and best for a world of lost sinners was slain. So I'll cherish the cross, the old rugged cross. to dark Calvary. So I'll cherish the cross, the old rugged cross, till my trophies at last I lay down. I will cling to the cross, the old rugged cross, and exchange it someday for a crown. To that old rugged cross I will ever be true. Its shame and reproach gladly bear. Then he'll call me someday to my home far away, where his glory forever I'll share. So I'll cherish the cross, the old rugged cross, till my trophies at last I lay down. I will cling to the cross, the old rugged cross, and exchange it someday for a crown. On a hill far away stood an old rugged cross, the emblem of suffering and shame. And I love that old cross, where the dearest and best for a world of lost sinners was slain. So I'll cherish the cross, the old rugged cross, till my trophies at last I lay down. I will cling to the cross, the old rugged cross, and exchange it someday for a crown. Oh, that old rugged cross, so despised by the world, as a wondrous attraction for me. For the dear Lamb of God left his glory above to bear it to dark Calvary. So I'll cherish the cross, the old rugged cross.
All right. Let's see here. Do a quick review. Maybe do a review. Let's see here. If you want to move that in the back, or you guys. Oh, there we go. Let's try it again. Okay. Well, go ahead and turn over to 1 Timothy 1. There's a map that we talked about last week. There you see Ephesus there in Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. And we have so much information about this church. Probably next to the church at Jerusalem, we know more about this congregation than any other. Paul would write the letter to the Ephesians. Paul will have these two letters to Timothy, who is at Ephesus. We have Paul in establishing the church in the book of Acts. We have one of the seven churches to the churches of Asia Minor, the 7 churches, one of those is Ephesus. So we have a lot of information that we know about. Hold on. I may have had it off. No, had it on. Where? Anyway, so we got into this last week, and we talked a little bit here about Paul in the first 2 verses establishes his authority as an apostle as he's writing to Timothy. Remember what we said about Timothy? He's probably somewhere in his early, mid-30s. You know, you can maybe stretch it and get him at 40, but beyond that, it's a little bit of a reach. When you look at the timeline, Timothy would have been a young man when he was converted. He was circumcised, you remember? His father was a Greek. His mother was a Jew, but his father, as the Roman household, would have had absolute authority and control, and they would have viewed that as a just backwood religion, doing that sort of operation, and so his father would have forbid circumcision. His father was not a believer. And so later on, when Paul is going to ask, Mrs. Timothy, right? Mrs. Timothy's mom, Timothy's mom, he's going to ask that Timothy goes with them, and he will circumcise Timothy. So he's probably 16 to 20 there around 50 A.D. This is written around 64 A.D., so you do the math, and he's probably in his mid-30s. And so there in verse 3, that I urged you when I went into Macedonia, stay there in Ephesus so that you may command certain people not to teach false doctrines any longer. And so we're going to talk a little bit about this here in just a moment. And there we see from last week there, the first couple of verses that emphasize the authority. God the Father, God the Savior. And he'll get down and talk about Jesus, the lordship of Christ. Paul, an apostle. Timothy is being sent by Paul, the apostolic authority here. He's establishing that here in this regard here. Now, you're going to find 3 times in this letter, you're going to find the word, depending on your translation, urge. Verse 3, look at 1 Timothy 1, verse 3. I urged you when I went to Macedonia to stay there in Ephesus so that you may command certain people not to teach. He'll say in chapter 2 and verse 1, I urge you. First of all, that petitions and prayers. And then he'll get over to chapter 6 and verse 2. Those who have believing masters, and he'll use that urge you, a sense of urgency. Why do you think he's pushing here? Why do you think he's using language like, I urge you? And the idea here in the Greek is the idea of to push. The idea is like a shove. We would, you ever been in those situations where you're kind of pushing someone, you're kind of shoving someone, and you're not there's times where we're being disrespectful and rude, but there's times where maybe you've grabbed somebody or in a dangerous situation or a child, and you're you're urging them, you're moving them, right? So what's going on here? Why would Paul use that language to Timothy? Why does Timothy need to be urged? Yeah. Go ahead, Jeff. Okay, and what would his, we don't want to get his personality, but we know a little bit from 2 Timothy 1, God has not given us a spirit of what? What's he tell Timothy? Timidity. So Timothy's a young man, right? And he's going to be rebuking and confronting false teachers. Do you think that's something that he's sitting there going in the preacher break room? All right, I can't wait to start rebuking these older And when you look at what we're going to see, among other things, the likelihood is that this also is in the eldership. Remember, go back to Acts chapter 20 when Paul, the only time we have an elders meeting note, what happened in elders meetings in the New Testament, we have Acts 20. And Paul says, remember, among yourselves, what? Wolves are going to come out, not sparing the flock. So the false teaching is going to come out of the eldership. So here's Timothy, a young preacher. Paul is on the other side, might as well be on the other side of the world. He's over in Macedonia, and Timothy's got to do some rebuking. And he's got to do some confronting. And he's got a big job in front of him here. He'll say the same thing here when he'll use, let me get caught up. He'll use the word charge 3 times in chapter 3. That I charge you or command you. He'll say down in verse, the goal. He'll talk about this is the verse 18. Timothy, my son, I'm giving you this command, this goal, or this command, or this urging here. This is a word in military terms in the New Testament. So this is someone who has some authority or has a rank, is a leader. I charge you to charge others. That's how that works, right? You know that chain of command. And so he's telling Timothy, this is what you need to do here, is give orders, to command, to instruct. And again, we talked about maybe why the urge. Why does he use the language urge and charge? Timothy may be timid here. This not exactly maybe what he's wanting to do is to go confront the leadership of this church as a young man. Certainly without Paul, right? And so Paul has given him this charge here. Look at verse 5 here. As he says that they would not teach false doctrines any longer, devote themselves to myths, endless genealogies. Such things promote controversial speculation rather than advancing God's work, which is by faith. Look what he says, verse 5. The goal of this command. What's the aim of this? Yeah. All of this is, the purpose of this, the aim of this, is not to correct or to confront, but to love, so that people can, the goal of this command is to love, which comes from a pure heart and a good conscience and a sincere faith. Why do you think he mentions those? This pure heart, or what else does he say? A good conscience. What's he say there at the tail end of verse 5? A sincere faith. Why does he use these adjectives? Why is these important, these particular importance? Right. Yeah, most of the false teaching, false doctrine is derived in the Bible, when you look at it, from false motives, from ill intentions, to gain power, to gain what maybe? Later on in chapter 6, he's going to talk about godliness that is gain. Because apparently some of these false teachers are profiting, right? Off of this, of their influence. And we know that is, that's not went out right 2,000 years later with teachers and people who would make profit off of godliness, quote unquote, godliness. And so Timothy's going to, how about this? Timothy's going to need this so he doesn't become susceptible himself to it. Have you ever thought about that? I mean, it's easy to go in, guns blazing, so to speak, and I'm going to correct, and I'm going to get in there with these false teachers, and if he's not careful, if he don't check his own motives right, what could he come out on the other side? Being just like them. Absolutely. Haven't you seen someone with good intentions sometimes come out on the other side and they're not the same? And so he's going to use this language here about it's a protective measure. And so this heart and this good conscience and this sincere faith that he's going to mention.
Hey, Robert.
Yes, go ahead, Jeff.
Kind of we're talking about, they're using the law and they're
Right.
doing this real confidently, and he says, it's funny, he says they really don't know what they're talking
Right.
about.
Yeah.
Sometimes we use the Bible against people
Yeah.
because of things that we've just grown up thinking, and we do that with the Bible.
Yeah.
Attack people with it, and that goes to the heart and all those things, the pure heart.
Mm-hmm.
You really love people, that's not really your intention.
Right.
Take the Bible and just,
Yeah. Yeah. Beat them up and
that's not what
no. And absolutely, Jeff. And we're going to come back to that in just a moment. Actually, when he gets into that, even that he doesn't even name names here. We're gonna note that. At least he does. He mentions two at the end. But look at this business of this teach a different doctrine. Verse 3, that certain people not teach a false doctrine. It's literally a teaching of a different kind. Kind of similar to Galatians 1 language, that if we are an angel from heaven, preach another gospel, right? Which is not a gospel, there's not another gospel, but this false gospel, this different gospel, and that he's going to emphasize, and of course he's going to emphasize this sound doctrine, this doctrine that's in accordance to the gospel. We'll come back to that in just a moment as well, that he's going to say. Sound doctrine just literally means healthy teaching. Doctrine means teaching. Sound means healthy. So someone's going to be, start a sound diet. They're going to start a healthy diet, right? That's the idea there. It's that which is healthy. And the way you know it's healthy is you look at the results. Always, how do you know if something is sound? You look at the results. Are they of God? Are they pure? Are they right? Are they producing the life, the gospel-driven life that is to look like Jesus? And so he's going to emphasize that here. Well, who are these false teachers? Look at verse 6 down there at verse 6. Some have departed from these and have turned to meaningless talk. Now he's going to mention two that down in verse 20, Hymenaeus and Alexander, look at verse 20, have suffered shipwreck of faith and have handed them over to Satan to be taught not to blaspheme God. But other than that, and if you actually look at the letters of Paul rarely, if ever, names names of false teachers. Why do you think that is? It's an interesting question. At least I think.
For one thing, these letters were meant to last through the end of the world. So for him to name names, we have no idea who Hymenaeus and Alexander were. It doesn't
Right.
mean anything to us. It did to the people that the letter originally went to.
Okay. What else? What do you think? Yeah, go ahead, Linda.
Well, Paul's still human, and he makes errors.
Okay.
And if he puts these people out there, he voids what he just said in verse 5, the approach with
Yeah.
and all that. So
I think you're on the right track, Linda. What does a label do to someone? If I label you, It defines you. And how hard is it to get off that label off of you? I mean, no matter what you do, even if you make amends and repent and make restitution, and I mean, have you ever had in your you got your storage, you got your my mind went a blank now. Help me out. What do we put our stuff in? Little totes, containers, yeah. And you put on there, have you ever had labels and they've been on there so long and you think, well, I need to get this one off, and you try to pull it off, right? What happens sometimes? The label's been on there forever. It kind of, you like half rip it, right? And then labels are very hard to get off. And I think that's one of the reasons, among others, and I think it's also what Linda tapped into, where's the love in that? Of labeling someone, of using that. And how effective, too, is that going to be when you come at someone and say, that so-and-so, they're a no good false teacher that hates God and doesn't love the truth. I mean, what's your chances of that person even listening to you often? And so I think you're on the right track, and I think that's why it is not the pattern of the New Testament to name names. And we have, thankfully, we've come out of that in our fellowship. That was not a very good history. When I look at it now, as an older man now, getting older, I look back on that as not a good time in our brotherhood when we named names, when we wrote people up. And I've seen it in bulletin articles and journals and brotherhood papers where people are slandered and assumed to be teaching something and believing something that they're not entirely at all. And that kind of stuff, I am thankful that has died in our churches for the most part. Because I don't think that is the New Testament pattern. There's a way to confront and address false teaching, I think, without doing that. And I think it's Paul doesn't even name the man in Corinthians who's sleeping with his father's wife, right? And so I think that's good. Yeah, go ahead. Oh, yeah, that's good. Yeah. Yeah. I like that. That's a great thought on that. Yeah, go ahead, Jeff. I agree. Yes, go ahead. Right. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a possibility. I think we come back to this next week. We're going to look at this section, and we'll kind of give a couple of speculations about why these two in particular that he does name, maybe they have reached that point of no return. Maybe it is so obvious and apparent to the faithful believers that these two are going down that path, because he mentions blaspheming God. And so, there may be that these two, yes, are so notable in their abandoning faith that he holds them up. But for the rest, he's trying to save and reach. And again, one of my mentors was Herschel Dyer, was at 10th and Rockford for a long time, my preacher growing up. And my first couple of years when I was over at Cleveland preaching, he was finishing up his last year or two before he retired. And I would enjoy getting together with Herschel and maybe have lunch. And I remember one time he was talking to me about, number one, he said, don't be afraid to teach what you believe is the Scriptures and your interpretation. He said, you're going to run up against brethren and elders and other preachers, and don't be afraid if that's what you believe and you've studied. And I remember what he said, though. He said, if you're off or you're wrong and you're sincere, God will bring you back. God will show you, kind of like what Philippians says, that if anyone opposes may God show them where they're wrong. And I think that always stood out with me. Number one, to don't be afraid to teach what you believe is the truth. Because Herschel, with all of his years of experience, knew that there's some people not going to like what you're going to teach sometimes. And so you can't be cow-tied to that every time. But I also remember that advice that if you are off and you're seeking God, you'll get back on track. And I think if Paul goes ahead and cuts the legs out of these individuals who are starting to embrace some false teaching, maybe even they're starting to promote it themselves, it undercuts all of this. And so with these two individuals, I think maybe there's something unique there with them going on. Yeah, Valora? Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest, I think, understanding of that is that they've somehow been now withdrawn from or handed over. Yeah, I think that's probably the likelihood of, and again, that would involve such a public aspect that the whole church would have understood that absolutely. But there's others that are following in suit, that are, if they're not careful, they're headed down that same line and that path. Okay, let's talk about these false teachers a little bit. We don't know the exact nature about who they are. So let me, a couple of things. Number one, we likely know that they're in the eldership because Paul in Acts 20 again says that among yourselves, the Ephesian elders, and that was probably, just a few years before he's going to later, a few years later, he's going to write this letter. So likely these are elders. When you get over to Revelation chapter 2, what's interesting, one of the things about the church at Ephesus, it says in that letter, is that they have tested those who claim to be apostles, false apostles. So you'd have elders, those that might be claiming to be a prophet. There we know there were New Testament prophets in the first century that spoke direct revelation from God. And so they are maybe some that are claiming to be apostles, one sent from God, or a prophet. Jeff mentioned this business of the law. So when you hear the law and you hear about some of the problems in the early church, Jew and Gentile, was there some issues there with the Jews who were being converted, becoming Christians? Remember what Acts 7 says, many of the priests were converted. And so you had all of these Jewish, believers with the law of Moses. They start themselves being converted, flooding into the church, so to speak. And what did we know that one of the problems Paul faced was what? What was called the Judaizers. What were they still teaching? That you still have to keep the law. And so likelihood this involves elements of Judaizers who were teaching these some aspect, and as Jeff said, they don't know what they're talking about. They don't know the law, but maybe some of these have been influenced by them. And then you've also got, don't forget, we mentioned the temple of Artemis, of Diana. I showed you a couple of the columns that's left. Last week I showed you a couple of images there in Ephesus. And you have these influences probably from the temple of Artemis and the temple Diana that are probably... So you've got... you think about what Timothy's facing. You got elders. You might have, we know some claim to be false apostles from Revelation 2. Probably some false prophets. You've got Judaizing teachers. You've got probably heavy hitters from the temple of Artemis that are coming into the church. Timothy's battling that every day. Now can you see why Paul is saying, I urge you, Timothy, don't be? It would be easy for him to want to lay low and not deal with this. Look at verse 7. What's the desire of these false teachers? What's it mentioned there? Okay, what's it say there in verse 7? They want to be teachers. Why do they want to be teachers so bad? What do you get, especially in that context and that culture, more than maybe we do? get honor, you get recognition. What else do you get? If you're not careful, what can you take hold of? Power, right? You can exercise over someone, right? Influence, control. And they want this control. They want this power. They want this authority. Again, later in chapter 6, he's going to talk about godliness as a means of gain. He's not going to talk about materially, financially. Some were doing that with power, with money. And then I come back to what Jeff pointed out. What's their tool? What are they using there? Apparently they're using the law. The law is mentioned several times here. And so now why would they use the law? Of all the tools they could use to try to gain power, why would they use the law? Okay, most familiar, people that have God-fears, that have, yeah. It's from God. What is in the law? I mean, there you go. I just answered it. Rules. If you want to control somebody, what do you need? You need lots of rules, right? You do this and don't do this, and you can't do that and don't do this. And I mean, rules. Now, did God give those laws and those rules? Yeah, He did. But they're to be used in a way that is proper and honors God and His plan and His purposes. And apparently they are completely misusing and distorting these. And Paul's going to kind of put it back on them here. You're going to see that in just a moment here. What they're look what he says here. He says that they have a lack of understanding. Look at verse 6. Well, they have verse 6 and 7. They've departed from these and have turned to meaningless talk. They want to be teachers of the law, but they do not know what they're talking about or what they so confidently affirm. They don't know the law. They don't know the proper usage. They're distorting. They're confused. And he uses the word here, that's what I wanted to point there in verse 6, meaningless talk. Does anybody else have another translation? Idle talk. Here's what he's saying there. The content, what they're teaching, they have content, but it's empty. It lacks conviction and application. I have, I don't do it like I used to, but I've listened to guys, people that come on the TV or radio over the years, some of these popular preachers that have, and I'll listen, and I'm patient. And this is what I do for a living. I love preaching and listening to lessons, and so I'll sit there and listen, and after 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes, I'll go, I don't have a clue what they're saying. But I mean, they're using words, and they're not boring. I mean, I'm not talking about they're not boring to listen to. I'm actually, not entertained is not a good word, but they have my attention, but I'm sitting there listening to them after a while going, what are they teaching? And then you pick up some of their books and, in this chapter, what are they? Here's what he's saying. They've got lots of content, but there's no conviction and application. What does it mean? Preaching should be clear. And if Tony was here for all these years, so I know his teaching was clear. If my teaching's not clear, you ought to run me out of here, because preaching and teaching should not be muddied. It should not be confusing. It should not be hard to understand. It should be concise and clear. Now, I'm never saying I'm never going to preach a sermon or class where you go, I don't really know what Robert was talking about today. I mean, we're all going to have a bad day but you ought to know when you leave, here's what Robert was calling me to do. Here's what God is calling me to do. It ought to be clear in its application and its conviction. And that's not about me or Tony, that's about the Word. Remember what it says about Jesus? He taught not as the teachers of the law, but one as what? Having authority. And here's what that means, among other things. The people got what he was saying. Do you understand what I'm saying? Don't be like a foolish man who builds his house on the sand and the wind and the waves come, and what happens? That house is what? washed away. Could people get that? Was that clear? Was that concise? Did that have also an element of authority built in it? Yeah, and so Jesus taught that way. Paul is teaching that way, and he wants Timothy to teach that way as a result, and they don't have that. Let me get it quickly here. I wish we could talk more about this law. We might come back to it. I do want you to see this. Look down here at verse. Let's get it here. I got that 5-minute bell. Look at verse 8. We know that the law is good if one uses it properly. Here's the key. They're not teaching it properly. They're not using the law in a good application. We know that the law is made not for the righteous, but for the lawbreakers. The Bible teaches that. One of the purposes of the law is to point out our sinfulness, our breaking of the law. And all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And the law points that out. Notice what he says. We know that the law is not made for the righteous, but for the lawbreakers, for the rebels, the ungodly, the sinful, the unholy, the irreligious, for those. Now notice what he says here. Look at verse 9 and 10. He's going to give, he's going to have this mirror, the Ten Commandments, the second half of the Ten Commandments. Notice what he says. They kill their fathers and mothers. They're murderers. The sexual immoral, or those who are practicing homosexuality, slave traders, liars, perjurers, or whatever else is contrary to sound doctrine. He mentions here in this list the second half of the Ten Commandments. If you look at this, honor your father and mother. Shall not commit murder. You shall not bear false witness. These things, what's the fruit? Again, go back to the fruit of their teaching. What's the fruit, the result of these false teachers? Is it producing godliness and Christ-like living? No, it's producing immorality. It's producing irreligious ungodliness. That's why he describes it as rebels, lawbreakers, sinful, unholy. And then he gives some examples. Those that kill their mother and father, murderers, sexual immoral, those who practice homosexuality, slave traders, liars, perjurers. He's saying their doctrine is not producing godliness. They're talking about the law. Let me tell you what the law of God did. It produces righteousness, that godly living as we try to reflect God in our life. And then he says here, notice, look how he says here, whatever else is contrary, he's going to say two things here in the end of verse 10 and verse 11. Whatever is contrary to sound doctrine, but he doesn't just stop there. He says in verse 11, that conforms to the gospel according to the glory of the blessed God which he has entrusted us. What's he saying there? Our lives, if we're being taught healthy teaching and healthy doctrine, it should reflect in our lives the what? The gospel. What's another way of saying that? Our lives, if we're being taught healthy doctrine and teaching, we should go out of here and we should look like who? Jesus. If we don't look like Jesus, right there, our teaching's not healthy. Our doctrine is not sound. And, you can see that today. I mean, some of this has relevant for today. When he mentions the sexual immoral, those practicing homosexuality, I'm not particularly fond of that translation. This is one of the couple of passages that some critics have tried to say that it's not outright condemning all homosexuality, but a particular kind, particularly men with young boys and so on. But that's not what Paul is saying. And so he describes here sexual immorality, and then he mentions one specifically out of there, homosexuality. But he also talks about those who don't honor their parents. And by the way, we talk about that a lot for the children and the kids. Well, these kids need to honor their parents. He's not talking to the kids, is he? Who's he talking to? Adults. To honor their parents. And so he talks about those involved in the slave trade and lying and perjurers. anything that's contrary to sound doctrine and does not conform to the glorious gospel. Here's the bottom line on that. You want to discredit us in the world's eyes, the culture's eyes? The best way, and this has happened too often in our Christianity, is we go out and we do not practice what we preach. That is the number one way that we disqualify the gospel. Us being able to preach the gospel and share the gospel, because you know it, people don't care what all you know and how right you are biblically and whatever you can say in your teachings, whatever your church preaches and sings about and prays about this morning. If we don't leave here and go out of here in our community and our jobs and we don't what? Live out the gospel, we disqualify ourselves. And we don't adorn the gospel with our lives. And he says, this is what it needs to do. Their false teaching is not producing that. And I would say a lot of the false teaching that we're seeing today in Christianity, just look at the fruit of what it's producing. It's not producing godliness. It's producing, I can live however I want, do whatever I want, and conduct myself however I want, and God will just approve of that. And that's not what what healthy doctrine produces. And so, these first 11 verses, he gets into a little bit of these false teachers. We'll come back to these false teachers a little bit later as well in the letter. So we'll pick up in verses 12 through the end of the chapter. So be reading the second half of the chapter for next week.